Namaste.
Namaste.
So we have two readings from the Bible today because fairness is so often believed to reside in the Bible. And it doesn't. At least not in the way that human beings understand fairness. And so I really wanted to use this Jonah reading because he was, of course, the first human loogie. If you know the story, God goes to Jonah and says, you need to get on over to Nineveh and tell them to straighten up or I'm going to destroy the city. And Jonah isn't too fond of the folks in Nineveh, so he hops on a ship going in the other direction. And the ship encounters rough waters, and there was a predominant superstition at the time that if you were on a ship and things weren't going well, it's because someone or something on the ship was basically ticking God off. And so they would throw things or people overboard in hopes that things would straighten out. And of course, it doesn't take too often when you're living in a superstitious culture and you don't know, and it's a pre-scientific superstitious culture, and you don't know the storm's about to end, and you throw old Bob overboard, and the storm just happens to stop, and in your mind, throwing Bob overboard made the storm stop. So the next time there's a storm, you know, if there's anybody on board named Bob, he's going overboard. And so Jonah gets thrown overboard and gets swallowed by a whale, which isn't, of course, possible. There's a story of a kindergarten student that was drawing a picture of a whale and Jonah, and the teacher came over and said, "What's that?" And she said, "Well, I'm drawing a picture of Jonah and the whale," and she had Jonah in the belly of the whale. And the kindergarten teacher said, "Well, you know that's not possible because whales, although they have enormous mouths, have very small throat openings, so a person would never fit." And the little girl said, "Well, when I get to heaven, I'm going to ask Jonah how it happened." And the teacher was a little irritated and said, "What if Jonah went to hell?" And the little girl said, "Well, then you ask him." So anyway, the whale hawks Jonah up onto the beach at Nineveh, and Jonah says, "Well, I can see I'm not getting out of this," so probably quite lacklusterly, he walks through the city going, "Oh, you better straighten up." And then he goes up outside the city and says, "Well, I'm going to watch the action." And the problem is that people do straighten up. And apparently God changes God's mind, which ticks off Jonah likely, because it wasn't fair. And fairness would have said, you're going to wipe these people out. It's not really much different from a Packers-Bears game. If the Bears win, it's not fair. Because they're bad. And where I was, I actually went for lunch at a place Saturday. And I went to the men's room. And at the bottom of the urinal, there were these 12 by 12 mats, two of them. And one of them had the Bears logo on it, and the other one had the Seahawks logo on it. I have a picture I can show you later. So we have this idea of fairness.
I have a shirt that says, "After further review, the Bears still suck."
That's right. So we know how it is. We're Jonah up on the hill. And God, of course, comes along and we heard how it ends up. And we can miss what Jesus is really saying about forgiveness in cases where, not here, but other places, the disciples ask him, "How often should I forgive someone?" And in one of the stories, he says 70 times. And we think, who the heck's going to count to 70? And in another story, he says 7 times 70. But what we need to understand is that 4 is the number of the earth in biblical numerology, north, south, east, west, right? 3 is the number of God. 3 plus 4 is 7. It's an image of perfection. 10 is the number of completion. So 7 times 10 is 70. It's perfection and completion. And if you're 7 times 70, it's perfection and completion with a little perfection thrown on top. So it just means an infinite number of times. It doesn't mean you count to 71 and go, "All right, now I can kick some ass." Now it's time I used up my 70. So this story is a story of the day laborer. It's a story of that joint on the corner of National and Cesar Chavez, where people stand outside getting ready to be picked up to work. And it was the predominant form of labor for the peasant of the day, and things haven't changed much. And I've heard it said that this story is a social commentary on the day laborer, and I really think that's reading a lot of 21st century stuff into first century stuff. But what it does point out, this denarius, that was a day's pay. That was what you got. It was a coin. Boom, there you go. And of course, the landowner is generous. The people who got a day's pay suddenly think it isn't enough, because people who only worked part of the day got a day's pay too, because it wasn't fair. And it's not fair.
Is that how unions started?
Well, many years later. It was the same sort of thing. Only it was probably the people who worked all day only getting an hour's worth of pay. So, what the statement that comes at the end is a statement that Jesus uses a lot. The last shall be first and the first shall be last. And it's a constant reversal of expectations, of cultural values, of what's right and what's wrong, and what's fair and what's not. Because quite often what's fair is used to keep people in a position of oppression. I could raise the minimum wage, but then a Happy Meal would cost $15. Now, never mind that studies show it would raise the cost of a Happy Meal about 35 cents. But we say that it would be unfair to Happy Meal consumers if we raise the minimum wage. And so very often what's set up as a standard of fairness is set up by the people in power. And the people who don't have the power have to accept it as fairness. And that's why Jesus was very subversive. And of course, most people don't want to talk about that. But he wanted to flip all of those standards all the time. And what's ironic is you hear people today, I happen to have a child who thrives on what's fair and what's not. More what's not than what is. That's not fair. This isn't fair. That's not fair. It's not fair over there. And what happens is it becomes a barrier between you and the other. Because in the end, if it's real, it doesn't much matter if it's fair or not. If the speed limit is 55, and you get a ticket for 57, it doesn't matter if it's fair, you still have a ticket and you have to pay it. And you can carry on as long as you want about how it's not fair, and it doesn't change the reality that you have a ticket. You'd be better off to go to court, right? It may not be fair that we run into situations where it seems like if the tables were all leveled, it wouldn't be the way it is. But complaining that it's not fair doesn't change anything. Working to change the system levels the table. And in the meantime, what Jesus is speaking against was this notion that the Jewish people had been fighting with for like 600 years, that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And then the Assyrians and the Babylonians came along, stomped on Israel, and carried the good people away and left the bad people living right next to where they thought God lived, and they had to all of a sudden question, is that really how it works? But those notions die awfully hard. We still tend to think, until we get a lot of evidence to the contrary, that people for whom things go really well must be good. Until Donald Trump comes along with the hair. Or remember Leona Helmsley? That's going back a while. Until we see somebody come along who seems to have it all, but who's an absolute raving jerk, to say the least. And then we're confronted by, well, how can this be? And so that shows that this notion hasn't died. Fair becomes fair if and when we work very hard against people who hold the power and make the rules to be sure that fair is fair. But complaining about it doesn't change anything. And this is one of the real advantages of a Buddhist perspective. Because somebody asked me this yesterday, I think, and as I was talking about it, you know, how do you summarize Eastern religion in 3 sentences or less? And it's, the goal is to see reality as it is. And this is where this becomes really helpful, because as we learn to strip away our stories, our stuff we pile on top, our ideas of how it ought to be, and look at how it is, really is, then we can start to ask ourselves, what do we need to do about it, if anything? Maybe things are fine the way they are. Maybe they aren't. But until we see them clearly, any attempt we make to change things is going to be distorted and misguided. It's sort of like if you happen to think, if your car breaks down, and you think that there must be a problem with the spark plugs. But the truth is that you ran out of gas. You can change spark plugs all day and night, and you're never going to drive away. So we need to understand the problem very clearly first. And that's something that the Christian perspective kind of loses. And the Christian perspective can get into this place where it's act now, act now, act now, without bothering to see things clearly. And I think that's why Jesus was constantly giving what's the equivalent of a Zen koan, in that he was trying to jolt people into awareness. The last will be first, the first will be last. And I'm sure his hearers said, that's not how it works. So he told the story where the last were first and the first were last. And then said it. And I'm sure his hearers said, that's not the way it works. But eventually, hopefully, if we run into enough examples of it, if we change enough spark plugs, maybe we'll pick up a gas can and tunnel on all over to the pumps and see if that might help. So fairness is a very relative thing. And true fairness only exists when we see things as they are and then make the changes that need to be made to establish that fairness. Amen.
By the way, God gives a spirit. I remember the last time he said it was in John 10:10.